So I won't give too much away. People are still joining. There we go. So yeah, how is everyone? I'm going to start. I may as well start because the first thing I want to do is actually go over some of the comments that we had from last week, because we talked about this temple, if you can see it here. And it just generated loads of, yeah, really interesting comments. I'm still just letting people join. So I thought it would be interesting to just spend 5 minutes going over it. So when we looked at the Kailasa Temple, which was the Hindu temple that we did last week, somebody commented saying that it reminded them of Angkor Wat. I think that's how you say it, the really famous Buddhist temple in Cambodia. And that's a really interesting comment because I was reading about Angkor Wat, and let me get the dates right. It was built in, oh, I have it here actually, in the 12th century. So this is a photo of it. I don't know if anyone's ever been in person. Let me know if you have. I know it's a really famous tourist attraction, apparently the largest religious monument in the world. So I've never been, but it's meant to be absolutely incredible. And so I was kind of wondering whether these buildings could be similar, the Kailasa Temple that we looked at in Angkor Wat. And it actually turns out that Angkor Wat was originally built as a Hindu temple, which is really interesting. And it was built by the Khmer Empire. I think I'm saying that right. It's spelt I've got it on the screen, Khmer. And it was an empire that supported both Buddhist and Hindu religious practices, which is which is really interesting to note, because I know in the very first session we were talking about how buildings teach you about religious tolerance. So yeah, originally this was the Kailasa Temple. Even Angkor Wat was a Hindu temple, which is why you can kind of see visual similarities in the Chitara point that we looked at, which we saw maybe, sorry, I'm still letting people in, which we saw in the first week. Okay, I'm going to have to pause to just do the admin side of letting people join the class. It's possible to go full screen on my screen. Oh yeah, people have been. Okay, I'm getting the messages now. There we go. There we go. Okay, you'll have to all be patient with me while we get used to the new Zoom. There we go. Okay, I think it's working. Okay, so far so good. I'll just check the WhatsApp before I carry on. I seem not to see you. Okay, I'm going to try to go full screen. So I think the problem with full screen is that I can't see the chat, which is the only issue. So I'll leave it like this for now, and then maybe for next week I'll figure it out. So yeah, just quickly going back over the comments from last week, because there was some really good ones. So this Angkor Wat comment, it turns out, totally made sense that you would see visual similarities. And I have some close-ups here so you can see that it's equally as sculpturally ornate as the Kailasa Temple that we looked at. This one here is particularly amazing. And then someone else pointed me to a group of temples called the Kandahar Temples. Let me just say it right. No, Carajo Temples of Madhya Pradesh. I'd never studied them before, but they were built between 950 and the 11th century AD. And there used to be basically 85 of these temples in the group. So if you remember, the Kailasa Temple was also built in a massive group of temples. And so was this one. So originally there were 85, and now there are only 22 remaining. So it's another kind of story of the destruction of art. But these temples that someone told me about are also interesting because they're actually for two different religious groups. So it's both a Hindu and a Jain temple. So again, it kind of teaches you about religious tolerance. And as we learned last week, Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism all developed around similar times in the same part of the world. So even though there was at points lots of religious competition between different dynasties, there were also moments of real tolerance and collaboration. And that's why you have temples like Angkor Wat that can look like Hindu temples but change to be Buddhist temples. So yeah, so I thought that was really interesting, and that was actually comments from two people who were listening to the session last week, so thank you for that. The other work of art that we looked at that I got lots of comments about is the Michelangelo sculptures that we looked at. So I know that we looked at David, but one of his most famous works of art is actually the Pietà. So I haven't put a date here, but it's around the same time. And it's interesting that someone brought this up, because last week we were talking about the destruction of sculpture, and not many people know this, but this sculpture was also destroyed in 1972. This is a close-up, just to give you an idea of the way that Michelangelo was able to sculpt skin is kind of what makes him most famous. So if you look at something like the arm here, yeah, you can see that he makes stone look totally fleshy, which is crazy. So anyway, as I was saying, this sculpture was destroyed. You can see it now on slide number 9. I'll zoom in. You can see that she has an arm missing on the right-hand side, if everyone can see that, and she has a chunk of her nose was removed. I'll just check the WhatsApp. So I have someone called Louise saying they cannot see me. I'll just check her. Still letting people in, so we'll just have to be patient. So yeah, this sculpture was destroyed in 1972 by somebody who was claiming to be Jesus Christ and came in and half destroyed. Anyway, it was really well put together. But I was really pleased that someone mentioned this, and I just wanted to quickly go over it at the beginning of the week. A, because it's a really amazing sculpture, but B, because it's gone on to inspire loads and loads of works of art. Probably one of the most interesting for me is this poster, which was an anti-Vietnam War poster, which said, "War is good business, invest your son." It's really difficult to get a good reproduction of this image. This is a photograph that I took at an exhibition. So again, it's not a very good photograph, but it gives you an idea. It's from the 60s, made in the US, and it's basically an artist using the sort of emotional, evocative nature of the sculpture to try and make people think twice about the war. And classical and Renaissance sculptures are always kind of used for political purposes like this, and I find it really interesting. And the other one that I will mention is this photograph by a contemporary artist called Rennie Cox, and she's an African-American artist, well, born in Jamaica and then moved to live and work in New York. And she kind of made her own version of the Pietà to make a comment on police brutality against Black men. So she recreates the composition of the sculpture to make people try and understand what it's like to be a Black mother in the US today. So it's being used for so many different political purposes, which I think is really interesting. And in the top right-hand corner, I'll just zoom in now. I just briefly wanted to include this to tell you that Beyonce also recreates Michelangelo's Pietà in her latest music video. So if anyone is a Beyonce fan, they can look out for it. So definitely for African-American empowerment, Michelangelo's Pietà has had totally unexpected connotations. So I think it's a really interesting one to bring up. For those of you who've just joined, sorry for the slow admin at the beginning. I had to keep letting people in because Zoom has all of these new rules. For those of you who've just joined, you're not late or anything, because I was just going over a few comments from last week. People sent me some really interesting stuff, and I just wanted to share it with everyone. So yeah, I will get started on the real class now. Just let me know, pace, sound, vision, everything's okay. I'll check the WhatsApp. There we go. Okay, everyone seems happy. Everyone seems happy, so I'll carry on. So, all good, everyone's good. Okay, nice. Oh, nice. Okay, I can work Zoom again. So, I've gone back to the image that we started with, which is a painting, because as I said, I promised that we are finally doing some painting. Actually, last week when we talked about sculpture, I mentioned I always like to start with something really old, kind of ancient, and it's much easier to do that when you're talking about architecture or sculpture because they're bigger, they survive better. It's very difficult to find ancient painting because it's made with natural materials, if it's that old, so kind of different plants mixed together, so it just doesn't survive very well. But there is one exception to the rule. We talked last week about the Mayan sculptures who had paintings inside them which were destroyed. But there is another building that has really old paintings inside, and it's in a different part of the world. It's in Mexico. I hope you can see my screen okay. So this is where you'll find it. I know it doesn't look like much from this view, but this is actually a Mayan temple, and it's in the middle of the Lacandona jungle in Chiapas in Mexico. And what I thought I'd do this week is focus on one geographical region. So we're going to look at Mexican painting basically, because we've done some kind of themes about religious building and the destruction of sculpture and stuff, but this week I thought we would just stick to one country, which we never do, and really do like a history of Mexican painting. So I hope that's okay with everyone. And we're really starting with the most amazing stuff, which is these paintings in the middle of Chiapas jungle, and they are called the Bonampak Murals. So inside this, I've circled the room that we should be focusing on. There are 3 little rooms, and inside you'll see this, which is totally unexpected. This is known as the Bonampak Murals, and Bonampak is the Mayan word for painted wall, which is why it's known as that. We don't know what they were originally called. And they were only discovered in 1946, which is quite unbelievable. I'm just getting some messages. Having problems with you freezing or losing sound. Sound coming and going. Okay, we'll just give it a minute to catch up with itself. Comes and goes a bit. Interesting. I wonder why that's happening if it's not happened in other weeks. Let me just try and sort it. Give me a second, everyone. Okay, I think this should help. I've got rid of some things on my computer, so give me a nod and stuff. Someone's been there. Oh wow, someone's been to Bonampak. That is really amazing. Yeah, that's really amazing. Apparently, you know, it's very difficult to get to. You have to go by foot and stuff. It's really in the middle of the jungle. What you're looking at here, I hope people are slowly starting to hear me a bit better now that I've closed some things down on my computer. Sound better now? Okay, great. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a reproduction, a kind of, yeah, an improved version. This is the more kind of realistic version of what they look like, a little bit worn down, but still totally vibrant. and I'm sure Sue can tell us more. Yeah, totally vibrant and bright blue. So I'll tell you a bit about what they actually depict. So this is another reproduction of what's inside. It is really well preserved, but obviously not this well preserved. So the paintings document basically a series of events that occurred in the 8th century during the reign of a king called Chan Muán. The first room is about his rise to the throne. And the second room is about this kind of raid that they did on a neighboring tribe. And the third room is about the success of that raid. And so they had a huge celebration that they document. And they also have, which was part of Mayan celebrations, if you go to the next slide, they had ritual bloodletting, which you can see here. If I zoom in, you can see it quite clearly there. So it wasn't just a kind of feast, they also took part in this ritual. And ritual bloodletting was quite common for Mayan people if you were part of the nobility, because it was seen as one of the ways that you could get closer to gods, because it put you in this kind of trance-like state. And the historians have tended to focus on this aspect of Mayan life because it's probably the most different, potentially the most stereotypical when we talk about ancient civilizations, to try and make them seem savage. So we have lots of reproductions like this one of the scene where you have this ritual bloodletting because it's what people were most interested in. But actually what we learned from, well, the most important thing that we learned as art historians about these murals is not about the kind of sacrifice of war victims or the ritual bloodletting, but actually something much less savage, which is the presence of musical instruments in Mayan society. I'm just going to read you a list of some of the instruments that they discovered thanks to this mural. So they had log drums, drums made from turtle shells, wind instruments, flutes, conch-shell trumpets, and more. So a whole list of instruments that they discovered thanks to these paintings. And you can see the date here, which I don't think I've mentioned. So 600 to 900 CE. Yeah, totally unbelievable, 1,000-year-old paintings that still survive in this bright blue. You can see that the image we're looking at now isn't a reproduction. So it's really impressive and a recent discovery. So I really wanted to talk about them to show you that there are ancient paintings that we can learn a lot from. As I mentioned, we're staying in Mexico this class. We've been in this southern jungle. We're now going to move up north to Mexico City and above, because we're going to talk about the Aztecs instead of the Mayan people. And the Aztecs had a different form of ancient art that survives. They did do murals, but the best surviving form of ancient art that we have from them is actually featherwork. They were extremely skilled feather workers, and they used feathers for shields, for headdresses, all sorts of things. I'll try and zoom in here so you can actually see how they used to make this stuff. It's really amazing, and it's lined with gold. So one of the most famous pieces of Aztec featherwork, which we're going to look at now, is this, if you can all see it. And this is actually the headdress of Moctezuma II. So who was Moctezuma II? He was basically the last Aztec ruler of Mexico. And he was the 9th ruler of the Aztec Empire, and he ruled from 1502 to 1520. And this was his latest headdress. So he heard about the Spanish starting to arrive in Mexico in around 1517. And then by 1519, Hernan Cortes, who is the Spaniard responsible, you know, in charge of the Spanish ship that arrived, came to Mexico City and met Moctezuma. And at the beginning, relations were not hostile. They exchanged gifts. Apparently, this headdress was one of the gifts that was given to Hernan Cortes and his Spanish team. But things changed within a year. So in the year 1520, a historical event happened called the Massacre at the Great Temple. And the Aztecs were having a yearly celebration, one of many that they did. And a few members of the Spanish crew locked them inside the temple that they were celebrating in and massacred them. So this awful event that really changed everything. So understandably, the Spanish were forced to leave Mexico City, and yeah, relations were no longer friendly. The Spanish kept coming back to Mexico City, and eventually Moctezuma was killed. And we're not exactly sure how he was killed, but it was a really important stepping stone to Spain's colonization of Mexico. So it's a really sad story. We're not exactly sure whether this headdress was a gift or whether it was stolen by Hernan Cortes, but it's one of the most amazing pieces of Aztec featherwork that exists. So I'll just give you a second to look while I check the WhatsApp. There we go. Okay, everyone seems happy so far. So yeah, let's talk a bit about this headdress. It's 1.3 by 1.8 meters. It's absolutely huge. And it's made out of more than 500 feathers from the same bird, which we will talk about in a second. So this is the original. What you were looking at is a really good reproduction, the one that's in the Archaeology Museum in Mexico City. But the original you can see is in Vienna, which is very contentious, and it's been a few decades now that they are trying to get it repatriated to Mexico City. I'll just zoom in on some of the details here so that you can see the gold, green, blue, and red feathers. Yeah, it's completely amazing. I've never seen it in real life in Vienna. I don't know, I think it's the, yeah, it says Ethnology Museum. I don't know if anyone's seen it in real life. But yeah, so it comes from a bird, if we go to the next slide, called, let me get the name right, called the Quetzal bird. And its feather tail, which you can see in this picture, could grow to be 1 meter long. And it was an incredibly important bird for the Aztec people and for Mayan people, actually, but it was thought by the Aztecs that one of their gods, the snake god Quetzalcoatl, who was named after this bird, always dressed with the feathers of this bird. So the blue and green colors were kind of reserved for the most important people, like Moctezuma. And yeah, and the name Quetzal actually means in Nahuatl, which is the language that the Aztecs spoke, large, brilliant feather. So it all kind of makes sense. And because these birds were so sacred, they were never killed, their feathers were just taken, and then they were set free. And you also have to imagine that it had really godly connotations. Even though I've mentioned a snake, the snake was seen as a really positive, powerful god. It didn't have any of these negative kind of Adam and Eve connotations that we have in the West. So yeah, we will come back to this headdress. But for now, let's look at the shields. The Quetzalcoatl bird is the national bird of Guatemala. That's true. Yeah, actually, when I was looking for photos of the Quetzalcoatl bird, most of the pictures that came up were from Costa Rica. So yeah, I wonder if it was used there in the same way. We will be talking about Peru a bit later on, even though I promised we would stay in Mexico, which we will for the most part. So yeah, these are the Aztec shields that I mentioned before. So it wasn't just headdresses, it was a whole range of things. And they had these huge feather markets where they sold these feathers. And the Spanish wrote about it when they arrived because they couldn't believe it. And they also had inside the emperor's palace a huge bird sanctuary, essentially. And that was where the feather workers who were employed by Moctezuma would work. And they were called, let me get it right, amantecas. So more than 300 people were employed always to look after the birds. And then alongside that, you had the people who actually worked the feathers. So this was a huge industry, one of the biggest Aztec industries. Now, the reason why we know all of this stuff about Aztec life and Aztec art is because of something that the Spanish made when they arrived, called the Mendel Fat Codex. And it's a huge book, basically, that's full of images. If I go down to the next slide, images and annotations in both Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and Spanish, depicting Aztec life kind of before the conquest. You know, within the first 20 years of the Spanish arriving, they produced this. And they actually asked Aztec people to do all of the drawings and the Nahuatl writing, and then they annotated it and translated it. And they did it because they wanted to send it to the Spanish king so he could understand what was going on in the New World, or in what they called the New World. And the codex contains an unbelievable amount of information, and it's actually now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, so you can make an appointment to go and see it in person. So we will come back to the Mendel Fat Codex as well. Now I'm going to show you the front page, so we're going to go to the very front of it, which has an eagle. I hope you can make it out. I've done like a zoomed in version. An eagle, a cactus, and a snake. Is the base shield material leather? So I think someone's asking what they used to do these featherworks on. Either leather or cotton, from what I see on the descriptions. So yeah, but you can't really tell. I will look into it. So yeah, this story about the eagle and the, keep the questions coming, by the way, because I can see the chat and it's great. The thing about this eagle is that it's not random. According to Aztec legend, basically, the Aztecs were fleeing from the north of Mexico in search of a new capital. And they were walking along and they saw an eagle landing on a cactus with a serpent in its claws. And they took it as a sign from the gods that this is where they should found their new city. And that's, yeah, someone's actually just said the Mexican flag, which is exactly right, because the next slide is this. That's why you can see this symbol on the Mexican flag. So it was really important for the Aztecs. And I mentioned before that the snake was this really positive, godly symbol. So for them, it was just settled. It was slightly inconvenient, though, this whole eagle and snake situation, because the eagle landed in the middle of a lake. So Mexico City was actually built on a lake. It was a series of islands and canals, and you can see a map that was made here for Hernán Cortés when the Spanish just arrived. So this is what it looks like. And the Spanish actually described Mexico City as a city floating on water. The sad thing about this story, because there's lots of sad things like the death of Moctezuma and all this stuff, is that the Spanish drained all of the lakes, and within a few centuries, Mexico City was dry, and that's because they wanted to expand the city. So a few more comments coming in. When I grew up in Mexico, we were told that Moctezuma had a premonition about the eagle and the snake, and when he saw it, he decided to build his city there. Yeah, that's absolutely right. History textbooks write that Mexico City was founded in 1325. So I think they had been there for a while before Moctezuma's rule. But yeah, every ruler had a really kind of important connection with this symbol. and so important that they would go on to put it on the Mexican flag. So yeah, we will check that. But it's a really important legend in Mexico, it seems. And if you grew up in Mexico City, please feel free to post lots of comments on this class. So yeah, it was, yeah, as I say, all the lakes were drained. But the one surviving in Mexico City is this one, which is called Xochimilco. It's on the outskirts of Mexico City, and it's just one of the few remaining canals. And you can take a boat to look down it, which is quite nice. And it gives you an idea of what the city would have been like. People say it would have been a bit like Venice, I suppose, in terms of the city on water. So we know all of this because the Spanish destroyed a lot of Aztec historical documents, but they made new ones and translated them. And I just want to stress that because the Spanish weren't always so careful in documenting the history of the cities that they colonized. So later on in their conquests, when they went to Peru and Bolivia in particular, they encountered the Inca people. And the Inca people spoke a different language. They spoke Quechua. And they wrote it not in the kind of Aztec pictograms that we've just looked at, but actually in knots. And it's known as quipu, which is the Quechua word for knots. And the Spanish preserved some of them, like this one, which you can see in the British Museum, but they destroyed all the documents that teach you how to read them, and they imposed Roman numerals, which means that we have these amazing historical documents from the Inca period, but we can't read them, so we don't know what they're saying, which is really sad. So the Mendel Fat Codex has become really unique just because it has so much information in it. And seeing as we've delved slightly into Inca art, I just wanted to briefly mention that the Inca people also made a lot of featherwork, and so did the Mayans as well. It's just that more of it survives from the Aztec period, from the Aztec region, I suppose. And I saw this in an exhibition, and I just had to include it because this feather carpet that you're looking at is actually from as early as 500 AD, which is just incredibly old, like a 1,000-year-old feather carpet, which is so unique because these things are unbelievably fragile. And the Inca didn't just make carpets with feathers, they were unbelievable carpet makers. And this one that you're looking at now, and I've tried to zoom in so that you can see the details of the weaving. This one is from as early as 450 BC, which is just unthinkable, honestly. So, and you can see that the Inca style is slightly different from the shields that we were looking at. It's much squarer, and it's more simplified patterns. So it is a different style, but they did a lot of featherwork. I've got a picture here. This is the shield of Aztec featherwork, so you can kind of make a comparison. So Aztec feather painting has been studied less than Inca featherwork, and the first book dedicated to it came out in 2011, which is the book you're seeing on the screen. So it's really, it's something new for art historians. And the book explains that the Spanish, they didn't just ask the Aztec people to help them make the Mendel Fat Codex. They also loved the featherwork so much, you know, bear in mind they had never seen feather paintings before. They loved the featherwork so much that they basically asked the Aztec people, the Amantecas, the ones who worked in Moctezuma's royal bird sanctuary and studio, to make Catholic feather paintings, which is what you'll see here. Here, for example, it's difficult to show these paintings in an online class because you can't, they're so crazy in person because they're totally iridescent really shiny and detailed. I'll try and zoom in so that you can see. And I've also got some better examples here. So these were Catholic feather paintings, and the author of the book, I'm going to read you some of what he explains. He's called Pascal Monnier, and he says that these featherworks were created by indigenous hands with traditional techniques, destined for European princes. Their purpose was not just to show the quality of feather art, but above all to represent the progress made in the conversion of the New World and the will of the local population to accept Christianity. So even though these feather paintings are so beautiful, and I'll just give you a close-up here, where you can really see the detail of the collaged feathers. And again, I'll look more into the base behind them, because all of them seem to have something different. And this is some images from the book, because the book has the most amazing reproductions, because it's really hard to get across the final effect of these paintings. You can get the idea here, the different sizes of the feathers and stuff, and the embroidery. And one that I thought was particularly amazing is this Spanish fan made with feathers. So they are really, really beautiful to look at, but you have to remember, which is what the book stresses, that they had this kind of insidious political purpose, exploiting a really traditional indigenous craft to convert people to Catholicism. So it's a tricky one. Yeah, it often happens with the most beautiful things in the history of art, because they are really amazing and very, very fragile works of art, but they have a political purpose. This is probably the best representation close-up of the effect. So these are two forms of ancient art making: the Bonampak Murals in the south, the feather painting in the north, that the Spanish encountered when they arrived. And I'm going to move now to kind of part two of the talk, which is less ancient, I suppose. We're jumping ahead a few centuries to the 16th and 17th centuries, and even into the 18th century, basically to the period where the Spanish had destroyed a lot of indigenous art by now. They were really settled, establishing new social norms, and being quite destructive with their architecture, which we learned about a few weeks back, you know, building cathedrals on top of the temples and stuff like this. And I wanted to include some painting to show that painting was another colonial tool for them. It wasn't just architecture and religion, they also really used painting. And they invented actually a new style, a new kind of movement of painting, and it was called casta painting. And in order to understand what we're looking at on the screen and what this painting was all about, you have to know a bit about the complicated role of race and racism and all the laws behind it that the Spanish invented when they arrived in Mexico. So their main concern when they were establishing these new social rules and laws about race in colonial Mexico is that they didn't want very much interracial marriage. And that's because the Spanish were really obsessed with the idea of purity of blood, the superiority of the Spanish race. That idea was really dominant at the time. So they established these rules about different races and whether they were allowed to mix. Honestly, it's so complicated that I'm going to have to read it. So first of all, you had a mestizo, and that was the offspring of a Spaniard and an indigenous person. Then you had a castizo, which was the offspring of a Spaniard and a mestizo. Then you had a mulato, who was the offspring of a Spaniard and a black person, and a morisco, who was the offspring of a Spaniard and a mulata. So it's extremely complicated and you don't have to remember it, but it's just to give you an idea of how rigidly they broke down these different interracial combinations. And depending on what you were, you had different social rights. And if you look closely at the image that we're looking at on our screen, you will be able to see that they actually label everyone in the painting. Mestizo con española, castizo, castizo con española, español, morisco con española, chino, like all of this stuff. So they were really rigid about these rules, and casta painting was their way of enforcing them. So if you zoom in on some bigger casta paintings here, you'll get a better sense of what their purpose was. So I should mention something on my notes that I haven't so far, which is that casta is the Spanish word for lineage or breed or race. And it was derived from the Latin word castus, which meant chaste. So it had this implication that your lineage should be kept pure, it should be chaste. So for the purposes of casta paintings, casta was kind of the ultimate, the perfect word for the Spanish to use. So this is the first example. I'll move on to the next one, which is here, some more casta paintings. You can see that they were obviously very pejorative about mixed race families. They showed them fighting, bleeding, spilling food. You've got examples here where they've got ripped up clothes for the children and the father, you know, being marginalized from society. You have to look really closely at the details of casta painting. You can see food being spilled here, just things generally going wrong, cheap food being cooked. So yeah, they're really pejorative political works of art. And of course, the depictions of white families of Spanish descent were always happy, wealthy, calm, as you can see. And it's really worth, when you have a second, zooming in on the details, because always, in order to identify whether something is a casta painting, you have to find the label. I'm zooming in here. You can't see on the computer well enough, but they've always got a label, mulata and española. Here you've got the label in the sky. Other times you've got the label at the back of the painting, pinned to the wall. They were quite inventive, really, about where to put it. I mean, this is more of a obvious example. You've got española and negra. And it tells you the mother and the father and the child, and it names all of them. So you really have to look for the label. And yeah, someone mentioned that all of the mixed race families are doing menial jobs, which is absolutely true. So really classist and racist works of art. That again, just like the Bonampak murals and just like the featherworks, have only just really started to get art historians' attention. So they're still being studied and understood. And one of the first questions that people had when they looked at these works of art is, who were they for? Because it's hard to imagine hanging something like this in your house. You know, who was buying these? And basically what we know is that this was a style of painting developed for the elite of Mexico, the elite of New Spain. And that's because the Spanish felt that it was most important to keep races pure amongst the elite. So they had to sell them this idea that mixed raceness was bad. And what historians have now said is that casta paintings don't show the reality of colonial Mexico, because the reality was that it was becoming a mixed race society and races were mixing a lot. And it was for this reason that they had to start producing casta paintings, not to kind of represent society, but to represent what the elites of society wanted it to look like. So you can't take these images as representative of the reality. They are more like a kind of imagined reality to try and keep the elite, basically. I've got another question coming in. Was it also a form of social document? Yeah, so this is what I'm trying to explain, is that these paintings don't actually, I suppose they're not really social documents. They don't actually tell us the reality of what was going on. They tell us kind of what the Spanish wanted to be going on, because yeah, the reality was much more fluid. They weren't that strict about the imposition of the laws. So Mexico became a mixed race society. And actually, when the Spanish left, when Mexicans finally achieved their independence in 1821, they decided that they wanted to celebrate this idea of mixed raceness. And they used this Mexican-Spanish word called mestizaje, which some people may be familiar with. And it's essentially, it just means mixed raceness. And they decided that Mexico was going to be defined by this mixed cultural heritage. It was going to be definitively a mixed race country. And you have to try to imagine the dilemma that Mexican society was facing after becoming independent, because it had this history of racism, this history of the destruction of indigenous culture. And yet it also had a society that was mixed race. There were still tons of indigenous languages and indigenous communities that were marginalized on the to the centers of cities and things. So they didn't know how to kind of unify everyone under one umbrella, because of course you still had lots of white Mexicans of Spanish descent. So they really jumped on this idea of mixed raceness that Casta paintings had tried to deny, and decided that that was going to be what unified everyone in Mexico. And that was obviously around the time of Mexican independence in 1821. But it was a debate that carried on, and I suppose carries on. And because people had like different ideas about what Mexican identity should be. And this kind of leads me into part 3 of the talk, I suppose, where we're going to get a bit more modern. So one of the most famous people who had a very strong idea about what Mexican identity should be is Diego Rivera, best known for being Frida Kahlo's husband. He wasn't entirely sure about this concept of mestizaje, this concept of mixed raceness. He was more interested in actually looking to the time before the Spanish arrived and trying to revive a kind of pure indigenous history without the Spanish history in the middle. And he made lots of works of art, but the one that I'm really going to focus on are these murals, which are in the Palacio Nacional of Mexico City. And they were made in 1939, let me get that right, 1929. They took about 6 years to make. And I've included this image so that you get an idea of their scale. So I'll just zoom in on the people here. They're absolutely huge, and they cover the whole walls. So I will just check the WhatsApp. I'm not getting any messages. Your date says 1977, not 1777. That's scary. The message on the WhatsApp about my incorrect dates. I will change those. So yeah, so this is Diego Rivera's huge Mexican history murals. Yeah, I'm going to go into a lot of detail about them so that we can really understand what was going on. The murals begin, it kind of works left to right, and they begin depicting a really glorious Aztec past. Before the arrival of the Spanish, like I said, you've got a really hardworking people who make jewelry, who make embroidery. And if you go to the next slide, he really, I mean, kind of like the Casta paintings, I find with a lot of the history of Mexican painting, it's all in the details, even with the feather paintings. If you zoom in on the history paintings by Diego Rivera, you can see he includes the original rivers of Mexico City back when it was a floating city. He includes in this right-hand side circle a picture of the snake god that we've mentioned a few times here. He really knew his history. He includes the correct food of all the Aztec people, the correct colors, the correct jewelry. He was a historian, really. And so that's kind of the first, I think I've mentioned everything. Yeah, that's the first side of the walls. But probably the most interesting thing for me is what happens next, which is that he depicts the arrival of the Spanish, which you can see here. And you can see, I will do various zooming in points so that we can get it right. But you can see Hernán Cortés. You may be able to guess who he is. This man with the white face, the one who looks very ill, decrepit, kind of very sickly. He doesn't paint him in a good light at all, which gives you an idea of Diego Rivera's politics. And if I go to the next slide, I think I've zoomed in actually, yeah. You can see here, these are the two kind of zoomed in sections of Hernán Cortés. On the left-hand side, he is taking money from someone. And on the right-hand side, he's actually converting an indigenous person to Catholicism. So yeah, this is an extremely political painting that really doesn't show Spanish colonization in a good light at all, because in the next slide, he also includes the enslavement and forced labor that the Spanish imposed upon the indigenous communities as well. So it's a very, very political and honest painting. And here, I've just circled a figure in the painting who is almost invisible and who you might not see because Hernán Cortés really stands out. But if I give you a close-up here, this is an image of a woman called Malinche. And she was a slave girl who Hernán Cortés found when he arrived in Mexico. Someone just asked me who he is. Hernán Cortés, if I'm answering the question correctly, is the man responsible. He was the first man to arrive and colonize Mexico, well, the whole of Mexico, in 1521. And Malinche, who I'm talking about now, was a slave girl who Hernán Cortés enslaved, basically. He found her when he arrived in Mexico, and he saw that she spoke both the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and Maya as well. She spoke both languages. And for that reason, Hernán Cortés took her with him, because apparently, legend has it, he had also found a shipwrecked Spaniard who had been shipwrecked for so long that he had learned Maya. So basically, with Malinche and this shipwrecked traveler, he was able to speak Spanish, which was then translated to Maya, which was then translated to Nahuatl, and then he could speak with Moctezuma, basically. So Malinche was the translator. And on the right, Diego Rivera depicts her in kind of Aztec glory. And then on the left. And then on the right, after the arrival of the Spanish, he hides her identity and makes her look really, kind of lost, to be honest. You don't really get much of a sense of who she is, which shows you how he felt about Hernán Cortés's exploitation, basically, of this slave girl. And Malinche went on to have a very complicated reception in Mexican history, because some people thought that she was a traitor because she made the original translations. But other people actually thought that she was kind of the mother of Mexico because she gave birth to the first mixed race child, because she had a child with Hernán Cortés. And when mestizaje and mixed raceness became really important, she was kind of hailed as the mother of Mexico by some people. So she's a really interesting character, and Rivera keeps mentioning her in a lot of the murals. I just wanted to mention one final thing about these murals, which is that he goes into so much detail that in the bottom right-hand side, if you can see the red circle, he includes this dog. I'll zoom in on it here. This black, skinny dog on the left-hand side, which you wouldn't think, but is another political symbol. So basically, this dog is an ancient, really ancient dog that was revered and deemed sacred by the Aztecs, and it's called a xoloscuincle, and it still exists in Mexico today. So I've got some images here, and it's characteristically hairless, and you can see in lots of museums in Mexico City ceramic and stone sculptures of these xoloscuincle dogs. So if you go back to Diego Rivera's mural, you can see that he depicts the dog really skinny, growling at the Spanish animals, which is obviously a kind of, my cat is interested, a kind of metaphor for what was happening, which is that the Aztec culture was being destroyed. And you know that, oh my God, my cat is trying to ruin the class. You know that the Spanish brought a lot of new animals to Mexico. Oh, careful. That's always want to be in the middle. You know that the Spanish brought a lot of new animals to Mexico because when we were talking about the San Juan Chamula church, we mentioned those chickens. So animals, it's a very political inclusion, this one. Anyway, so we are over time because it's already 8 o'clock, but I didn't want to finish the class without talking about, well, very briefly talking about Frida Kahlo, because this is another image of the mural to give you, again, the size of them. But, oh yeah, I wanted to include this as well. My cat's distracted me now. But I wanted to include this as well, just to say that if you do look at Diego Rivera's murals in more detail, do try and think about like the different styles that he uses for each part of the mural. I have found that the colors really change depending on whether he's painting something Aztec or something Spanish. The Spanish colors tend to be more dull, whereas the Aztec colors are a lot brighter, and he includes a lot of blue because that was the kind of sacred color of the Aztecs. So I'm gonna have to move my cat because she really wants to get involved. And she's gonna, there you go. Yeah, so if you look at them in more detail, just try and think about like the stylistic differences between the different things that he paints. So anyway, I can't finish the class without mentioning Frida Kahlo because she's too famous. All I wanted to say about her is very briefly that I don't know if anyone went to the Frida Kahlo exhibition. Was it last year already? The one at the V&A. But I just wanted to say that most exhibitions and books focus on the very personal aspects of her life. People often know that she had a very traumatic life. She couldn't be a mother, for example. She couldn't have children. She was in a very terrible car accident. And a lot of her paintings are very, very personal, psychological paintings. But I just want you to focus next time you're like reading about Frida Kahlo on the more political aspects of her work, because I find that with women artists, often people focus more on the personal aspects than the political aspects. And actually, Frida Kahlo was extremely political. She was a communist. This painting that we're looking at now, called Self-Portrait on the Border Between Mexico and the US, is all about how she felt that Mexico was that the US was corrupting Mexico. So she kind of puts the glorious Aztec past on the left-hand side with these ruins and temples. And she includes this kind of soil that is contaminated by the fumes from the US. So she was very political, and a lot of her paintings that I'll include here, the ones that are overlooked, have loads of indigenous motifs in them. They have the xoloscuincle dog, they have Aztec toys, they have Aztec temples in the background, for example, here. And people often forget that she had really political ideas about Mexican identity. And just to give you a final example, this painting here, My Nurse and I, is very famous self-portrait, and people have interpreted it as a kind of comment from Frida about how her mother didn't breastfeed her, she was breastfed by her nurse instead, and how this gave her, how this made her feel even sadder, I suppose, about her inability to be a mother, and she reflected on it a lot in her later life. But people have overlooked the fact that her nurse is wearing an Aztec funerary mask in this painting. And some people have even suggested that it's simply because she didn't remember what her nurse's face looked like. But it's really not the case. It's definitely a political inclusion about the kind of nourishment that Mexico could find from its Aztec past. So that is all I will say about Frida Kahlo, because she is very familiar to a lot of people, but do look out for the kind of political bits. I'll stop talking now because we're running over, because there were a few complications with Zoom at the beginning of the class. But do feel free to start asking questions or telling me things that I probably don't know about all of this material, if you've seen it in person, for example. And oh, we've got comments from Spain. We're enjoying the exhibition a lot. I'm glad people are enjoying it. And yeah, it is really sad as well. Someone else said it was sad because it's a very complicated history. And I will say that everything I've included in this class, like the Bonampak murals, the feather paintings, the Casta paintings, are completely at the kind of cutting edge of our history. They are things that we are still learning so much about. They're really recent discoveries, so if anyone has opinions to share on it, then they would definitely be valid. So someone else has asked, how are the feather paintings conserved? Yeah, that's a good question. I was reading about this. Apparently the biggest thing that destroys or complicates the preservation of feather paintings is vibrations. I'm not a conservator, how do you say that? Conservationist. But apparently vibrations, even ones that we can't feel, basically make them deteriorate. So the ones that we have are conserved in cases that absorb all vibrations. And actually that's one of the things that the Vienna Museum says to kind of justify keeping Moctezuma's headdress. I'll just go back to it. It was near the very beginning, this one. They basically say that if they were to put it on a plane, the vibrations would destroy the featherwork. So it is, yeah, that is a hugely contentious point. But they're really, really difficult things to conserve, more so than any other textile, apparently. So yeah, we're lucky to have the ones that do survive. And we don't have very many Catholic feather paintings either, these ones that we saw a bit later. Yeah, and I will just say finally, this Inca carpet, I have a book and I just wanted to see if I could show you the scale of it. I don't know if anyone can see that. Just to give you a sense that this 2,000-year-old carpet is like massive. It's absolutely amazing. I just had to include it. I'm getting a few more questions on WhatsApp, but feel free to go dropping out if people have to leave. Yeah, I think people so far are happy. So thank you for being so patient today. I know it was a bit more difficult to get started. Zoom have all of these new security things, so it's a bit complicated to kind of get going, but it should get easier. And also, as we saw, thank you to the person, the anonymous person who gave us the Zoom membership, because it means we've had an uninterrupted lesson, which is so great. Just one final question for those who are staying. So how come a lot of Mexican art is dotted around the world? That's a really good question. And And it's another one of the sad things about this history is that a lot of this stuff that we've looked at isn't in Mexico. A lot of the feather paintings that we've looked at are in France. These Inca carpets that we're looking at now are in the US. The Moctezuma headdress is in Vienna. It is basically because of Spanish colonialism, because the Spanish would send everything they could get their hands on to the king, who would then parade it across Europe. So it's ended up in Germany, in Austria, all over the world. So it's a real shame, and there is a real movement now to try and get these things repatriated, especially because there is an amazing museum in Mexico City, the Anthropology Museum, which is huge, where there are more than perfect conditions to keep these really ancient works fast.